Hi, everybody. My name is Tamara. I'm originally from Austria, but I studied in the UK in London, and then I became a prison officer. So for 2 years, I worked as a prison officer in a prison in the northwest of England. And during my time there, I learned a lot about how relationship building can really make a huge difference in the prison service. Before I get into my explanations, I'd like you to imagine being in a prison cell. And I'd like you to imagine that when you wake up in the morning, your door is slammed open, an officer walks past and opens all the other doors, and then they go back to the other officers into an office, and you don't see them. And if you want to speak to them, you have to go into the office, and they ignore you most of the time. And when you want to go to work, they just unlock everybody and let you go to your different workshops. Now, I want you to imagine that you wake up in the morning in your cell and you've got an officer opening your door, telling you good morning, asking you, what are you going to do today? Are you going to a workshop? Are you going to education? When you go on the landing, you see other officers around, you see the officers having conversations with the other prisoners, and you see a bigger sense of community. Now, these are very different scenarios, and I've seen both in landings of prisons. And there are three differences that are the result between having a more enclosed environment and less interactive environment, and having those relationship building environments that I mentioned in the second scenario. So one, it's all down to recruitment. If we have people who have the right intentions and who want to become a prison officer because they want to make a difference, because they want to rehabilitate, because they're non-judgmental, because they want to build relationships and they want to support the people in their care, then this is a great starting point. That doesn't mean they're going to be, we can just put them on the landing like that and we will just forget about it all and they will just do their job. But we need all of those skills and those attributes that they have at the start and their right intention and mission and vision before they even join us. Once they join, we deploy our training. And I think when you think about it this way, if you train somebody who doesn't care about all the training that you're developing, they're not going to take it in anyway. So you can chuck all the best training at them. You can show them, oh, this, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. But if they say, well, actually, I just became a prison officer because I want to lock people up, then the training is not going to make a huge difference. So you need the people with the right intentions to go into your training. Then next is the training. And what's really important with prison officer training or prison training in general is a lot of the stuff that you will learn is also learned on the job. So as much as you try and sit in a classroom and tell people about relationship building and about 5-minute intervention skills and about control and restraint and use of force techniques, still a lot of times it's really hard to employ that in real life. So it's first of all really important to not only train in a classroom, but also try to develop some scenarios. And also it's important to keep checking in during the time in the prison and have that continuous relationship with the trainees. So let me explain more about this. About the scenarios, in my training as a prison officer, every week we had one scenario evening where, after we've learned about different skills and different employability items and different soft skills that we needed to employ in our work, we were put into different groups and we entered a classroom, and our trainers would pretend to be either a prisoner or a prison officer, whatever the scenario was like. Let me give you an example for that. So one scenario, I was called into the education building as a prison officer, and the member of staff who was there, who was the teacher, had been disrupted in their lesson by one of their prisoners. And I, as a prison officer in the scenario, had been asked to remove that person or at least de-escalate the situation in a way. And I wasn't told much in previous to the scenario. I was kind of put into that scenario, just, you've been called to the education building, see what expects you there, because that's reality. You don't know what you're going into a lot of times in prison. And so I would then go in and I would speak to the people who are the prisoner. I would speak to the education staff, and I would employ the skills that I've recently trained in my daily training. And those scenarios really, really helped not only to assess us and assess our confidence in the training, assess how much we took the training in, but also it gave us a little bit of a real life taste to what it means to actually use the skills that we've been learning. And it made us more confident in displaying ourselves in those actual real life scenarios. So what I mean by that is that at the end of the day, we are who we are. And it's not of use if we're trying to pretend that we're somebody else. So with all the training, it's important to take it all in, but we also need to figure out, how does that work for me? And how can I use the right language? How can I work on these work with all these different people? How do I build relationships successfully? And this was a huge part of prison officer training, where the scenarios gave us that kind of extra opportunity to practice all these skills. At the end of the day, as I said earlier, that still meant that after we arrived in our different prisons, we still were due to receive mentoring. We were still due to receive reflection sessions, and we were still due to receive additional training. So with regards to the mentoring, we were lucky enough that we had a mentoring prison officer. That was a person who had been a prison officer before and now worked solely as a mentor for us. So they had the experience of working on the landings, they had the experience of all the training, and they were able to give us their advice, but mostly their space of reflection. So rather than us meeting up for an hour and sitting down and then telling me, well, actually, you should be doing this and you should be doing that, I would be presenting them with different situations that I've been finding myself in. I would talk to them about situations where I was unsure if I did the right thing or unsure what I should have done instead. And they would ask questions back. So I could find and derive my own solution and really find my own way of how to deal with the situation, because it wouldn't have been of use if they said, well, just do that. Just tell them to go back to your cell. And I say, well, actually, but that's not who I am that way. So I need to have a different attitude and a different way of approaching that situation when I feel like I'm losing control of the situation. When it comes to all of the training that prison staff get, what I've received is quite unique, because I was part of the Unlock Graduate Scheme. So this is a leadership program for recent university graduates who then become full-time prison officers and do a part-time master's. So unfortunately, all this training is not the standard, and it's not the standard in most countries in the whole world. It is not the usual perception that prison officers' key work is relationship building, but it should be. Because at the end of the day, we can build safety and security, as Elizabeth already said, through building those relationships between members of staff and with the prisoners and with the people in our care. What I've really noticed is that I've never been afraid of being assaulted, or I've never been afraid of being put in a situation where I'd find myself subject to violence. And a huge part of the reason why is because I always felt confident in building relationships with people and showing them that I'm an officer. I will give them the security, and I will show them that I'm here to care. And I will do my utmost to make them feel safe and to support them in their rehabilitation. And through those relationships and through giving them the sense of possibility of change, the sense of support, and also a little bit of compassion. I always felt safe in my job because I knew if I have that relationship with somebody, they will not harm me intentionally. And yes, there were times where maybe something could have gone better. And I have found myself in violent situations, but it was never intended that way. There was always a reason behind it. There was always we didn't really quite understand that person. We didn't understand any of their personality disorders, perhaps. We didn't know how to deal with them. And so a lot of times that was what resulted in any difficult situation. And before, I know that we're running out of time, so before I end, I would just like to give a final example. We were working with a prisoner who'd had severe-ish learning disabilities, and they were also on the autism scale. And a lot of the times we were participating with them in something what we called stepping stones, which was a sort of engagement activity for those who couldn't really work in the general workshops or in the general education. And another officer was leading that, but I was still in the same department that day. And suddenly I heard something burst. It sounded like glass, and that prisoner had punched through a window and had taken a huge piece of glass and was starting to self-harm with this. So in that moment, I had a really good relationship with that prisoner. And I knew that if we were pressing the general alarm, which means that all the officers come together and try to restrain that person and try to put them back, either to their cell or even to a separate unit, I knew that that person would just hurt themselves even more, or perhaps others, because that person the prisoner had a weapon, right? So unfortunately, another colleague of mine immediately pressed a general alarm because they were threatened by the piece of glass and they were worried that they would be hurting somebody else. So suddenly we're finding ourselves in a situation where we're stood against, the prisoner is facing the wall, and me and another officer who had a good relationship were sort of shielding them, and all the other officers were running towards us and were trying to back us up and were trying to get to that prisoner. And me and the other officers were like, just give us some space, please. Give us a moment. And we were talking to the prisoner and we were saying, please don't hurt us. Please put the glass down. Listen to us. And we were using the broken record technique, trying to just get through to that person. And after 2.5 minutes, they did drop the piece of glass and they did walk back to the cell just with us, and we could have a conversation. And I think that is a really great example of how relationships can make that huge difference, because usually if me and my colleague hadn't been there who had that good relationship with that person, everybody would have just gone to restrain that person. Maybe somebody would have gotten hurt by the piece of glass. And all of those issues can be mitigated by building relationships. So thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. I am wondering, so we have a researcher, Berit Johnson, present from Norway, who did research into large-scale facilities and smaller-scale prisons. Maybe you can share a little bit, Berit, because my question is, to what extent is relational security realistic within a large-scale prison? And I would love to hear the reflection of you, Tamara, and Elizabeth, and maybe also Berit.
I contacted Rescaled because I believe that relational security and relationship building and supporting a person in their rehabilitation is definitely much easier in a smaller scale detention house. It is definitely not impossible. I've seen good relationships being built in larger scale facilities, but being short-staffed, being 3 officers per 70 prisoners, relationship building will work with the one-off and there will be good relationships, good working relationships, which you can establish, and you can also build on the teamwork that you have with the other officers and the prison staff in general. But I 100% believe that if we had smaller scale facilities where we could actually facilitate that one-to-one contact much more, then not only would we build better relational security and safety within the prison, but also we would support a person's rehabilitation, and we wouldn't have so many people who just fall through the gaps, because it usually in the larger scale prisons, it's who shouts the loudest, but a lot of other people still need our help, and we just don't deal with them because we don't have the opportunity or time to build that relationship with those people.
And Elizabeth, what do you think?
I think I'm very glad that I don't work in the prison service and I work in mental health. You know, I have had some experience of prisons, but it's always struck me as almost impossible to envisage how, when you have 3 prison officers with a ratio to 70 prisoners, how you could even begin to form relationships. So I think, although I know that you've followed the route of looking at prison services and looking at things like dynamic security for your own services, which has a straightforward logic to it, there is more logic in some ways in looking at what mental health services have done, because they do have those ratios, greater ratios of staff to service users, and theoretically their starting place is support and care rather than necessarily detention and containment. The one thing I would say is I have seen some large scale services in mental health that do relational security very, very well. I've seen some small scale mental health services that are incredibly dangerous, where staff don't care, they're more interested in containment, and that's more driven by their own sense of safety and harm. So it doesn't necessarily follow for me that you go from large scale to small scale and you get relational security right. It's entirely dependent upon the people that you employ, how competent, how capable they are, whether they have the right attitude and ethic, and whether they trust each other or not, and that continued development. So it would be a mistake to say you go from large scale to small scale, you can definitely do relational security. It entirely depends on the people that you employ and support.
Interesting. Berit, maybe you can share a little bit about your research, since there's also it's on mute. There's also a learning lab in much more detail.
Sorry.
So just a few sentences.
Yeah. I caught interest in this topic because the concept of relational security, I think, has a parallel with what we, at least in the Norwegian prison service, refer to as dynamic security. It's a human factor. And what I really liked with the presentation of Elizabeth is that also you put effort on or highlighted the relationships between the patients and between the prisoners, because that is also important, how you compose a unit, how flexibility within a prison is very, very important to have the means to compose, to take out prisoners that doesn't function, to put in new ones and so on. But dynamic security mostly is understood by the relationship between prisoners and prison officers. And in a small-scale prison, you are much more dependent on this kind of security measure to function, because you are such a few people. You are perhaps 3 people at work. So you need to handle incidents by talking to prisoners. And then you are totally depending on learning how to know them. An example, I was just thinking of it now. I was interviewing, she was a woman prison officer, a very cheerful woman. And she was working in a small prison. There was a prisoner, he was really, really angry. He was banging in his door, he wanted out and so on. And she went to talk to him. And when she arrived, he said, "Oh no, not you. I cannot be angry at you." You know, so this is about relations, you know. She had a good relation, she talked to him, and then the whole situation calmed down. So I think it's so much, and Norwegian prison officers are trained in this. They have 2 years of education. They are trained how to use this. But also, what I have found very, very important, and with reference to Hey and Spark, you sometimes feel that, or they say that it is like prison officers belong to a magic circle because they do something that you cannot understand. And I think that prison officer work is a very sensory work. They smell. They very fast learn to know the normal. You know, how a person function at a norm when its thing is normal, how the unit function when the thing is normal, and when something diverges from the normal, they keep their attention at once, because they know then is something's going on. It could be a sound or the absence of sound or something else, the smell that shouldn't be there. So there is so much into this that I find very interesting. And what I find very interesting, I was Googling while you were talking, Elizabeth. I was not paying attention. I was Googling and found also articles or research that has been doing on this relational security, which the dynamic security concept it's very little researched on it. So I think we have that it's a lot to learn from the work that you have been doing on this concept in the context of dynamic security. But I think that it's easier to get dynamic security to work well in a small scale prison because you're totally depending on it, that it's working.
Thank you. Noah, you have a question.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you, first of all, for your presentations and contributions. I think in both your presentations, Elizabeth and Tamara, you mentioned that importance of doing the training at the start when staff actually starts in a certain service or starts their career at all, as well as the value-based recruitment. So I was wondering if you could just touch shortly on your experience in training people who have been doing this kind of work for 10, 20 years, or giving training to management who has been in that management function for 20 years, or even, I think you touched on that, Tamara, in your last example, bringing together staff who had that new training and then having people who had different training, like the person maybe who wanted to press that general alarm button, that kind of the I guess I would say maybe difficulties of bringing those different experiences together under that new model, under that model of relational security.
So it's a really good point to raise about the existing staff and staff who've been incumbent in services for maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years. Everybody gets really preoccupied with introducing new starters and new people into our services. And I try and tend to focus people on training our existing staff. There's no point training a new starter if when they get to their service, whether that's a big ward or a small scale unit, if that culture doesn't already exist there, it will evaporate instantly and you've wasted your time. I think it would be easy to get frustrated with people who've been in services for a long time, maybe 10 or 15 years. But as leaders, we are partly responsible for why they function and behave in the way that they do. So I think some degree of understanding about the culture that we've created is really important, rather than just blaming them for being belligerent or different in their style. This is culture change. This is not about training and learning. This is about understanding the extent to which people feel safe and trying to unpick what it is that makes people feel safe. So in my experience, a lot of the time, what makes people feel safe is rules and regulations, and people have the sense that, you know, if we're flexible or human about something, our services will turn into anarchy, and they don't see that actually it's our inflexibility, it's the perception that we're inhuman a lot of the time that actually creates the frustration and violence in our services. And certainly in our services, I think we'd have a tendency to diagnose. So we see behaviour as somebody's diagnosis or their history, whereas in actual fact, many of the people behaving in the way they do are behaving in exactly the same way that you and I would, given the same set of circumstances. So it's about creating that understanding. So I think our existing staff, particularly as you identified, those people who've been in our services for 10 or 15 years, who have grown up in a different culture, almost needs much more support to work through that process. And I'll hand over to Tamara because she's got more experience than I do.
Thank you. What you just said really rings true. So prison culture is what changes the attitude, and then we can go in with additional training, additional skill sets that we can adapt on and expand on. But Alison Liebling has some really interesting work on the prison officer and also the prison culture. And she was recently at an event in Vienna, and she was speaking about how the prison governor, so the head of the prison, really makes a difference in how the staff approach relationship building. So it is a lot about staff culture, and just by training and just by trying to get new people in and just pushing them in and hoping for the best, that's not going to do the job. But we need to have a mixture of all of these things. So we need a culture shift. We need to appreciate the prison officers and their work. A lot of times, my colleagues don't even realize that they employ relational security. They use the skills that we've learned at college and they hadn't. They, a lot of times, do all the things correctly, but just don't really know about it, and that's why they don't employ it as well as others could, or they cannot act upon them, which I think really works with the see, think, act wording of your presentation and your work, Liz, because a lot of times they see, they think, but they don't really understand, and so they act differently than what we might expect or what we would need. So it's trying to break that barrier and showing them, you're doing all of that. This is not completely new work. You've already done all the hard work and hard developing of the skills, and now let me guide you in how we can move that into that right direction, into the acting bit. So that would be my answer to your question. I hope that helps.
Could I please just add something to this, because I think you are into something very crucial, and that is a lot of these people working in prisons is also psychiatric ward. I guess there's a tacit knowledge there. They know it, but they aren't articulated. And how should we teach it when this kind of skill are not articulated? So that's because I'm interested in researching this to, in a well, find concepts, meaningful concepts, so we can learn from these people with all this knowledge that they don't know that they actually have, and use it in training of new officers.
Thank you. Elizabeth, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, only that I think that the point that Noah mentioned was about leadership. So I just thought I'd come back to that very briefly. I think it is one of the things that we've missed here in the UK, and we need to place more emphasis on that. We often train our staff and then breathe a sigh of relief, and we're missing out a whole layer of strategic development training around relational security. There are limits to what people can accomplish with relational security at a service user facing level if our leaders don't understand it, if they don't understand the strategic connections. Most of the work I do now is about leadership training, and then we have facilitators now who train people in their own organizations. So people who they build those skills internally, so they have that flexibility to do supervision and reflective practice rather than just an external person training. I most enjoy the leadership training because unless you get that right, you're not really creating a culture. I had one service in Canada who said, we weren't sure that we were ready for relational security because we thought we'd have to change our culture first. But what they said later was, actually, we found that by doing the relational security work, that was the trigger to change our culture. So it might be one thing before the other.
Thank you. Maybe Ulrich, one final question, then we will round up. People might need to leave, but it was also very short and it's very interesting. So I hope you have a little bit more time. But Ulrich.
Thank you. We run small detention houses where we do a lot with these relational things, and I'm very grateful for what I heard about the confirmation of steps we went. We do, in addition, we work in larger prisons with 400 inmates, and there we have so-called prison houses. We are responsible for having there 3 or 4 colleagues for a number of maybe 20 young men. We see a language problem rising, with having the whole world in prison at the moment, with especially these young detentions from the refugee background. And we see that we have less and less youth, which qualifies for our programs, because we can't work with them without an interpreter between us, and those prison interpreters are not very helpful as the go-between. What is your experience, Tamara? What do you see? Is that in your prison that you say, okay, we have at least a common ground of language? We see at the very moment we really have young people who have no ability to speak, for example, about their feelings without a proper translation.
So that's a really good question, and it's not necessarily a huge issue in the prison that I worked in the UK. However, it's something that the Austrian prison service quite similarly faces as well. So this is an issue that I've been discussing a lot with members of the Austrian prison service. And it is all about representation in the workforce. So we need to encourage and show people from various backgrounds that they can also become detention officers, and that role isn't the harsh, let me just stereotype, tall, bald man, but actually can be any of you. And it's really important to have that representation, because otherwise it's just recolonialization really within the prison service, and it's a huge issue with racism as well. So we need to make sure that our staff represents the people that we are working with as well, because otherwise we cannot build those relationships. If people come from different backgrounds, different cultures, they will not build the same trust. They cannot build the same relationships with the members of staff. And it feels very personally awful to me to be thinking that actually 47% of the Austrian prison service are of the Austrian prisoners are foreign nationals, but 99% of the officers are white. I think that's a huge issue that we're facing, but it's about breaking the culture of what it means to be a good prison officer, of who can be a prison officer, but also supporting individuals who dare to be, pioneers and dare to step out of their comfort zone, to become officers, to become work in detention houses from different cultures, from different backgrounds, and to show them, we will support you. This will not be easy, but here's mentoring, here's the psychological support, here's all the additional opportunities that we can give you so you can be those pioneers. And just to finalize this, as an example, through the Unlock Graduates program, which is the program I became an officer with, we had the first female officer with a headscarf in a men's prison in England, and she felt empowered to do that by having the support through the program, by being supported by other members of staff, by being encouraged to even apply in the first place, because she never thought that would be a job for her. But by showing the narrative about the role needs to be changed and giving her the support and opportunity to do that, she enabled herself and she was able to become that person. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea. Thank you.
Thank you. For those that are interested in reading more, Elizabeth has shared some information with me. And like we always do, we always share the list of participants with the name and email addresses. So I will share that. So please send me an email if you don't want us to send that to all the participants. But this way you can also connect amongst each other. And I would like to thank the two speakers, Tamara and Elizabeth, very, very much. It's very helpful and insightful for us to also build the concept of detention houses, because it's one thing to have an idea and a plan and a wish, but another thing to actually execute it and how to do that. And I think relational security and all the work that's been done in mental health and also the work in prisons has been very useful for us. So thank you very much. And thank to all participants for being here, for listening, for finding this topic important. Thank you. Enjoy your day and happy holidays, Christmas.